In today's video, I would like to teach you one of my favorite openings for the black pieces against 1e4. The Pirc Defense is a counter-attacking opening for black, where we first allow white to build this amazing pawn center and let them feel comfortable, maybe even too comfortable, as our plan is going to be attacking the center with our pawns and pieces and ultimately destroying the center. First, let's take a look at the couple of first moves. They start with e4, we're going to be playing d6, and after they grab the center, we're going to be playing knight to f6, which is attacking the pawn on e4. It's important not to start with the move g6 over here, as our opponents can play c4, and now this is no longer the Pirc defense. Pirc defense happens when this pawn is still on c2. So most of your opponents are going to be playing knight to c3, like 95% or so, but some of your opponents who are beginners might be overextending very early on and playing e5. Then black is immediately getting a good game by capturing on e5, exchanging the queens, and moving the pawn into g4, where we're going to be hitting two pawns and black is going to be a pawn up. So even though this is not going to happen very often at this particular moment, as a Pirc defense player, you will learn to appreciate when white is overextending prematurely. That's usually what white should not do, and this is going to give you a lot of chances to win with the black pieces. So let's assume they play knight to c3, and we're playing the move g6. Almost always, we're going to be playing for this fianchetto setup and castling short. Now here there is a branch. We have to look at a couple of lines. First is the classical variation where white is blocking the f-pawn. Then what if white plays for the f4 move before they play knight to f3? That we call the Austrian attack. Looks dangerous, but we're going to learn how to react against that. And the third variation would be when they're trying to move the dark square bishop out, and sometimes with even idea of castling queenside and then launching a pawn storm attack against our king. So first, let's take a look at the most popular line with knight to f3. Going to respond with bishop to g7, and here white has a choice where to develop the light square bishop. If you're a beginner to intermediate level player, a lot of your opponents are going to play bishop c4, which looks very natural, but it gives black the chance to destroy the white center very early. We're preparing this idea of knight takes e4, and after they take, we're going to be winning the piece back with the fork. That doesn't win us the material, but we're going to exchange the e4 pawn for the pawn of ours that is not currently centralized and leave white with only one pawn in the middle. Now, it's very important to castle first and only then execute this idea by taking on e4 and then playing d5 with the fork, and the best response for white is to keep the bishop. And as you can see, white center has almost been destroyed. All we have to do is play knight d7, play c5, and black is completely equal. Now, why do I say we should castle over here? Well, if we take on e4 right away before we castle, they have this tricky move bishop takes f7, which is a desperado tactic. They're going to lose a piece anyways to this fork, so that's the best way for them to lose the piece, as they disrupted our castling prospects, and here white has little advantage. So watch out for this bishop c4, and whenever it's there, prepare this idea of knight e4 followed by d5. If your opponents play bishop c4, you get equality right away and no problems in the opening. So let's take a look at the move bishop to e2, after which we're simply castling, and you could notice the pattern that almost always we're going to be playing these moves first, like d6, knight f6, fianchettoing the bishop, and castling. Exceptions will start happening when white is going to play very early dark square bishop development. And here there is a big branch. Black has so many plans to choose from. That's why it's such a rich opening, and it's very difficult to play it with white and with black, because all the different plans that black could go for lead to completely different positions. Now I'm going to mention here just two plans for you. We're going to look a little bit deeper at bishop to g4, but I'm going to give you a very good alternative to that, playing the move c6. Why this move? What's the point of it? Well, Later in the game, we're going to try to make it harder for them to play the move d5. We're opening our queen, which may go to c7, may go to a5. And then black's plan is to play knight bd7 and e5. Sometimes knight d7, queen c7, and then the move e5 in order to strike in the center. To make this video shorter, let's just talk about bishop to g4. Well, what's the point of this move? And here we can start discussing the idea of the space. What is space? What is space advantage? Well, because white has more pawns in the middle, that means that their pieces, bishops and knights, have more safe squares in the center from our pawns. So that is basically what space advantage usually means, that their bishops and knights are going to occupy the center or more centralized squares than the black's pieces. However, if we exchange a couple of minor pieces, black will have enough room for all of their pieces to be happy, and so this just becomes space, no longer an advantage. In other words, if we were to, for example, take away the knights in this position, then this pawn center gives white perhaps non-existent or very marginal advantage compared to the position where all four pieces exist on the board. So understanding as a Pirc Defense player that in general, exchanging the minor pieces benefit black due to that reason. Now, there is an argument that while you're exchanging this bishop for the knight, you are giving up the bishop pair. So even though white's pawn space advantage might matter less, but then they get a compensation, which would be the bishop pair. In fact, the idea of bishop g4 is not just to exchange the piece. The idea of bishop to g4 is to remove the knight for a different reason. We're going to try to fight against the squares d4 and e5 with the moves knight c6 and or e5. So this knight currently is guarding these squares very well, and black needs to get this trust with or without knight to c6. So when they're going to be playing h3, we're removing the knight, but not just to exchange the pieces, but to actually play knight c6 and come with e5. So a lot of your opponents may play the move d5, which locks their center. Now it's closed and it becomes a target, but most importantly, it leaves this e5 square available. Now, if the knight was here, they would be able to damage your pawn structure, and that was the whole point of exchanging that bishop for the knight. So a lot of the times opponents run away, and then black could fight against this with the move c6 and try to attack the black center. If f4, we're simply going for knight to d7, and you could see that there is still massive pressure on the white center. And if white is playing almost perfectly, we are getting to a position that looks like this, and you could choose between two plans. For example, trying to go for e5, or other grandmasters, they prefer a move queen a5. Queen would be flexible with ideas of queen to b4 attacking b2. Now, if we play knight c5, we can take back with the queen in case they take us. Rook to b8, and black's position so far is rock solid. The only problem usually for black, if black loses the games, would be white's space advantage, which may or may not be converted into a kingside attack. But because black has such a good grip on the center with the pieces and pawns, that is not making white's attack formidable, and black has an okay game from here. So that's pretty much the main idea of this move bishop g4, and I would recommend playing for that. I think at your level, you would find it easiest to equalize with this one. Now let us take a look at another way how white could be playing, and that is going to be the Austrian attack. Let's repeat the first couple of moves. Knight f6 on the second move, very important. Now, the move that makes this an Austrian attack is f4. Looks formidable. White has a lot of pawns in the middle. However, we're just going to play for bishop g7 and continue with our setup. Once again, we're looking forward to white overextending themselves. It's very important to always look for these moves with black and make sure that you have a good reaction against e5 and d5. But it's almost always the same pattern, that we're retreating somewhere with the knight, after which we're going to break with c5 and then try to destroy their pawn center. So after a move like knight to f3 and we play c5, it looks absolutely horrendous for them. And usually at your level, you'll get this like 25 to 50% of the time, and white is already having a worse position over here. For example, they take on c5, we're gonna take on e5, and I prefer here black all day long. As you can see, the white center simply got destroyed. Now, if we flip the board and take a look at that e5 move there, for a lot of people it doesn't look too bad over here, like what could happen. And only after playing that move and seeing the c5 coming, they will realize that they have overextended. They grabbed more than they could chew, and white simply has undeveloped army in order to control all of this new territory that they got. Now I have to say that e5 in general strategically is not a bad move, but white should have all army develop before they could conduct such an aggressive play. So let's say they play knight to f3, and we're going castle, and they will play the move bishop to d3. That will be the main line. Now, how does that differ from the previous lines? Well, this time, because the pawn is on f4, it's a little bit easier for them to play the move e5. They have an extra support for it. Sometimes they may also play for f5 and kingside attack, but that's very rare or comes a lot later in the middle game. And because we're going to see this bishop d3 most often, the move that I recommend over here is knight to c6. Once again, teasing them to play d5 because we have a good reaction against it. So the idea of knight to c6 this time is to prepare e5, and we can no longer hope to play bishop g4 and remove this knight and do the fancy things against e5 and d4, because this pawn is on f4 and just gives more support for the white over the e5 square. So remember, in the Austrian attack, in our repertoire, we're not going to be playing bishop g4 at this moment. So what if they do push? Like, what's the idea behind it? Well, that's overextending, and because we have the bishop on d3, we can actually move the knight to b4 and attack the bishop on d3. They cannot give it away, and after they move away the bishop back, we're gonna start attacking the d5 pawn. What if they play a3? We're gonna simply move back the knight to c7, and this d5 becomes a target. So usually people take the knight already, but the pressure against d5 still continues. For example, if they take the pawn, we're playing queen to b6. In this position, on the next move, we can take the pawn, and there's pretty much no way white could defend it. So it's very, very important, once again, I'm emphasizing, to know reactions against e5s and d5s. So what if they play e5 at this moment? Well, here we can simply take and place the knight on d5, as the bishop is blocking the queen. Now, most of the people at higher levels, they just castle in this position, and then we have e5, which works tactically for black, and we're completely destroying the white center. So for example, let's say takes and takes, and if they take the pawn once again, it feels like we're only attacking it once and it's guarded once, but we can actually take on e5 because of this tactic, queen to d4, and white is simply left with an isolated pawn. A moment ago, you saw this massive center for white with the 3 pawns in the center. And now look at what happened. So that's a consequence of this e5 move and the right strategy for black. So a lot of people, they actually played the move d5 in this position in order to not give white an isolated pawn. And black would simply play the move knight to d4 because the pawn on e5 is guarded by a discovered attack. So for example, they could take on e5, but then we're taking the pawn and revealing the discovered attack. And once again, black finds himself in an equality with the destroy center for the white pieces. So these are some of the ideas you could use against the Austrian attack. And let's take a look at the third option for white, which is also very important to cover. I hope I will not make this video too long, but you simply cannot finish the Pirc Defense opening video without revealing some ideas against this early bishop development. So white's idea usually is to just play for queen to d2 and then castles long and pawn storm you on the king side. My recommended move over here is either c6 or a6. a6 is more of a new move, which might be better objectively. c6 is more of a classical move. But what's the idea behind it? Well, the idea is that if they're going to just play queen d2 and castles long, we're gonna attack them quicker. We don't even have the king right now on the king side, so their whole idea of attacking this king of ours very quickly is going to be counterattacked by that. Plus, this move also a lot of times opens up the black's queen. So how could it look like? For example, our opponent plays queen to d2 and we play the move b5. Here, if the castle long, you could notice that not only we're attacking quicker, but also the pawn on e4 will be dropping. So bishop d3 would be a better response by white, after which we're going to simply play knight bd7. If the castle long, once again, we're ready to attack them much quicker. An example game would be queen to a5, and just take a look how black is developing the attack. c5, you can see our king is very safe for now. Knight to f3, b7. And this was just an example game, how black managed to outplay white. And black found himself in a slightly bit better endgame with better chances to play for a win. So most of the people, they delay castling long if black is playing this way and just simply play knight to f3. And I will give you a couple more moves in order to understand the setup, castles. And for example, over here, we're ready to play for e5. Black has a solid game and white's attack is nowhere near to be seen against the black's king. So that would be some ideas playing against this bishop e3, queen d2 castles long setup. Wanted to give you the big picture of what the Pirc Defense is about. I hope you enjoyed today's video. You can consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. My contacts are on the right. Thank you very much for watching and see you in the next video.